In the Middle Ages, entering a forest could be more dangerous than going to war. And no, it wasn't because of wolves or bandits, but because of the laws. Today, you're going to learn about 10 medieval forest laws so absurd that hunting a simple rabbit could send you straight to the gallows. The forest was the king's property. In the Middle Ages, the idea of nature as a common good simply didn't exist. For the peasants who lived on the edges of vast and shadowy forests, every tree, every animal, and every leaf on the ground had an owner, the king. These lands, known as royal forests, weren't just hunting grounds. They were the physical manifestation of the monarchy's absolute power, covering nearly a third of the territory in places like England. The concept was simple and brutal. The land belonged to the king, and everything that inhabited it did too. This didn't just mean majestic deer or fierce boars, but also rabbits, birds, wild fruits, and even the fallen and rotting wood on the forest floor. For the people who depended on natural resources to survive, this law was a sentence of hunger and cold. Imagine a peasant with his family shivering in the harsh winter. Just a few steps from his hut, there was a forest full of dry wood, fallen branches that could warm his home and save his children from illness. But he couldn't touch them. That wood wasn't nature's, it was the king's. The audacity of picking up a simple branch was seen not as an act of survival, but as a direct challenge to royal authority. The foresters, men loyal to the crown and feared by the people, patrolled these lands with relentless vigilance. They weren't there to protect the ecosystem, but to protect the king's monopoly over it. Being caught picking fruits or chopping wood meant facing severe punishments, ranging from exorbitant fines impossible to pay to terrible physical torments. The Forest Law of Norman England. When William the Conqueror invaded and took England in 1066, he didn't bring just armies and a new nobility. He imported a legal system that would terrorize the people for centuries: the Forest Law. This wasn't a single law, but a complex and oppressive body of rules that designated vast areas of the country as royal forest. The goal wasn't conservation, as we might think today, but the preservation of the king's and his favorite nobles' hunting privileges. Overnight, entire villages, farms, and common lands that had sustained communities for generations were swallowed up by this new jurisdiction. The people living in these areas weren't evicted, but they began living under a regime of exception, where their lives were governed by cruel and arbitrary rules different from the kingdom's common laws. Under the Forest Law, the life of a game animal, especially the deer, was legally more valuable than that of an ordinary human being. Hunting a deer was punishable by death, often by hanging. But the crimes went far beyond hunting. Cutting trees to build a house, clearing a small field for crops, or even carrying a bow and arrow within forest boundaries was strictly forbidden. Peasants' hunting dogs had to be mutilated, a process called expeditation, where the claws or tendons of the front paws were cut so they couldn't pursue the king's game. The enforcement of these laws was carried out by a hierarchy of officials, from local foresters to the justices of the forest, who presided over special courts where a guard's word was worth more than the testimony of a dozen peasants. This law wasn't just about protecting game, it was a tool for social control and a demonstration of power.
Killing a deer was treason. In medieval symbolism, few animals carried as much weight as the deer. For the peasant, it was a source of meat, hide and bones, a promise of survival. But for the monarchy, the deer was much more. It was a mirror of royalty itself. Considered the king of the forest, its nobility, strength, and majestic stature was seen as reflections of the monarch's own qualities. The deer wasn't just an animal, it was sacred property, a living icon of the king's power and divine right. Therefore, hunting a deer wasn't simply an act of theft. It was a direct attack on the sovereign's person and authority. It was considered an act of treason. The punishment for anyone daring to kill a royal deer was the most severe possible. The offender wasn't treated as a mere food thief, but as a traitor to the crown. The sentence was almost invariably death, and the execution was often a public spectacle designed to instill fear and obedience in the population. The illegal hunter could be hanged from the nearest tree, beheaded in the public square, or subjected to excruciating tortures before death. In some accounts, the guilty were blinded and mutilated before execution, a visceral demonstration of what happened to those who touched what belonged to the king. The message was unequivocal. The life of a single royal deer was worth more than that of a starving subject. This law created a terribly ironic situation. While nobles and the king organized extravagant hunts, killing dozens of deer for sport and to stock their sumptuous banquets, a peasant who killed a single animal to feed his starving children was executed without mercy. Hunting with the eyes. The level of paranoia and control imposed by medieval forest laws was so extreme that in some cases a crime could be committed without any physical action being taken. The mere intention or suspicion of it was enough to lead to punishment. Thus was born one of the most bizarre and terrifying concepts in forest jurisprudence, the crime of hunting with the eyes. The idea was that a prolonged and covetous gaze toward a forest animal, like a deer or a boar, was evidence of intent to hunt. A man didn't need to carry a bow, set a trap, or even step off the permitted path. If a forester saw him watching the king's game with what he judged was a hungry look, it could be interpreted as the first step of a crime. This accusation was terribly subjective and practically impossible to refute. How could a peasant prove his gaze was one of innocent admiration and not predatory planning? The forester's word, as a royal official, was almost always final. The punishment for hunting with the eyes varied in severity. It could be a heavy fine, a public whipping to serve as an example, or even imprisonment. Though it rarely led to the death penalty, the punishment was humiliating and painful, designed to reinforce a state of constant fear. People living near royal forests learned to police themselves in an almost unthinkable way. They controlled not just their actions, but even the direction of their gaze. Imagine walking along a road skirting the forest and seeing a magnificent deer grazing just a few meters away. The natural instinct would be to stop and admire the animal's beauty. However, in the Middle Ages, that simple act was loaded with danger. The fear of being seen by a guard and accused of hunting with the eyes made people walk with their heads down, avoiding any eye contact with the forbidden wildlife. Children were taught from an early age not to point at animals in the forest and to look away quickly. This law turned nature itself into a trap. The beauty of wildlife, which should have been a source of wonder, became a source of anxiety and danger. In those lands, even thoughts and intentions were considered the king's property, and a simple glance could cost the man his freedom.
Punishment for picking up fallen wood. During the brutal winters of the Middle Ages, fire wasn't a luxury, but the thin line between life and death. For peasants living in flimsy, poorly insulated huts, a lit hearth meant warmth, the ability to cook the few foods they had, and a barrier against diseases that thrived in the cold. The fuel for that fire was wood, and the most obvious source of wood was the forest. However, under forest laws, even branches that fell naturally from trees were considered the king's property. The right to collect wood, known as estover, was strictly regulated, and in most royal forests, completely forbidden to common folk.
Picking up fallen wood, an act we would consider trivial and even beneficial to forest health today, was classified as theft against the crown. Desperate peasants, trying to warm their families, were forced to sneak through the forest at dusk, quickly gathering small bundles of dry branches, always with the paralyzing fear of being discovered. The foresters were relentless in pursuing these wood thieves. Being caught red-handed, even with a handful of branches, resulted in terrible punishments designed to be both painful and symbolic. A common punishment was mutilation, the loss of a hand or fingers, the just penalty for the hand that stole what belonged to the king. The logic was cruel. The offending hand could offend no more. Other offenders were branded with hot iron, receiving a permanent scar that stigmatized them as criminals for the rest of their lives. This mark served as a constant warning to the entire community. The law was so sweeping that it prohibited not only wood collection, but also lopping trees, even if it was to feed livestock with the leaves. This prohibition choked the peasants' lives, who saw the forest's abundance just steps away, but were condemned to shiver in cold in their homes. The image of a family huddling in the dark, without fire, while the king's forest was full of fuel, is a powerful portrait of the era's injustice. In the Middle Ages, royal power was so absolute that even cold and warmth had an owner, and the people were left to freeze in the darkness.
Weapons prohibited in the forest. The prohibition of weapons within royal forests was one of the most fundamental and effective rules of the forest law. Officially, the justification was simple and logical: to prevent illegal hunting. By forbidding peasants from entering the forest carrying bows, spears, hunting knives, or accompanied by dogs, the crown aimed to protect its precious game. Without the necessary tools, poaching became exponentially more difficult and risky. For the nobility, this ensured that deer and boars remained abundant for their hunting tournaments and banquets. However, the people knew there was a much deeper and more sinister reason behind this law. The weapons ban wasn't just to protect the animals. It was to keep the people subjugated, defenseless, and under control. An unarmed peasant was a docile peasant. The forest, with its winding paths and dense vegetation, was the perfect place for ambushes, secret meetings, and the start of rebellions. By ensuring that only the king's officials were armed within these vast expanses of land, the monarchy neutralized a potential threat. The law turned the forest into a one-sided hunting ground, where foresters were the armed predators and peasants the defenseless prey. Anyone caught with a bow and arrow, even if claiming it was for self-defense against wolves or bandits, was immediately considered an illegal hunter. The punishment was severe and, once again, symbolically cruel. It was common for captured archers to have the index and middle finger of their right hand amputated, the same fingers used to draw the bowstring. This mutilation not only prevented them from hunting again, but also made them useless as archers in wartime, stripping them of a valuable skill.
The noble rabbit. It may sound like a bad joke, but in the legal hierarchy of medieval forests, not all animals were created equal. While the deer was the king, other smaller creatures also enjoyed protected status that put them out of reach of hungry peasants. Among them was the rabbit. To us, the rabbit is a common animal, but in the Middle Ages, especially in the warrens, rabbit warrens, established by the nobility, it was considered a luxury delicacy and a symbol of status. Rabbit meat was tender, abundant, and highly valued at court banquets. Therefore, hunting a rabbit on royal lands or in a noble warren was a serious crime. The disproportion between the crime and the punishment was shocking. A man desperate to put any kind of meat on the table for his children might set a small, silent trap,
hoping to catch a rabbit for a stew. If discovered by a forester, he wouldn't face a simple fine. The punishments were severe: public whippings, imprisonment in terrible conditions, or even hanging, all for an animal that reproduced in abundance. A peasant's life could be destroyed by attempting to hunt one of Europe's most common creatures in the landscape. This illustrates essential truth about forest laws. They had nothing to do with scarcity or conservation, but everything to do with monopoly and privilege. The irony was served on the plates of the rich. While a peasant was hanged for hunting a rabbit, that same meat was prepared with expensive spices and served on silver platters in castles and mansions. One man's hunger directly sustained another's luxury. The noble rabbit was a glaring symbol of medieval society's deep class divide. For the nobility, control over game, no matter how small, was a way to display their wealth and power. Owning a warren was a mark of prestige. For the peasant, that same rabbit hopping near his garden was a constant reminder of his powerlessness. He could see the food, smell it cooking in the Lord's banquets, but touching it meant risking his own life. The law turned a vital food source into a forbidden luxury, and the struggle for survival into a capital crime. Punishment without trial. In a society governed by laws, even if unjust, some kind of legal process is expected: an accusation, a trial, and a sentence. However, in the depths of the royal forests of the Middle Ages, the law itself could be suspended. The foresters, charged with protecting the king's interests, operated in an authority vacuum, often possessing powers of judge, jury, and executioner. In many regions, these guards had the right to administer summary punishments without the need for a formal trial. If a guard believed someone was guilty of illegal hunting, his belief was enough. This created an absolute regime of terror. A peasant caught in the forest, even if just gathering herbs or looking for a lost farm animal, was completely at the mercy of the guard who found him and his mood. The guard could decide on the spot if the man was guilty. If he did, the punishment could be immediate and brutal. Whippings could be administered right then. Mutilations, like cutting off an ear or blinding an eye, could be carried out with the guard's own knife. In extreme cases, the guard had implicit or sometimes explicit authority to kill the suspect on the spot. The forest became, as the people called it, a land without justice. These summary executions were the crown's most powerful psychological weapon. The bodies of the executed could be left hanging from a tree as a macabre warning to passers-by, or simply disappear into the forest depths, leaving families in permanent anguish and uncertainty. No one dared question the disappearance. Asking questions could attract unwanted attention from the guards and put the whole family in danger. Silence was the only form of survival. This absolute authority inevitably corrupted. Guards could use their power to settle personal scores, extort money or food from villagers, or simply exercise their cruelty without fear of consequences. The forest wasn't just a place where the king's law was supreme. It was a place where the law itself could cease to exist, replaced by the arbitrary whim of a single armed man.
The forbidden forest to enter. Within the already restricted system of royal forests, there was an even higher level of exclusivity: the closed zones, or pales. These were areas of the forest considered the king's personal sanctuary, territories where the presence of any common person was strictly and absolutely forbidden. It wasn't about regulating activities like hunting or wood gathering. The mere physical presence of a peasant within these boundaries was considered a grave crime. These areas were generally the richest in game and the most beautiful in landscape, reserved solely for the monarch's and his most intimate court's pleasure. They were surrounded by ditches,
fences, or natural markers, and entering them, even by mistake, was seen as an act of defiance and invasion. The reasons for this total exclusivity were twofold. First, there was the desire to ensure that the game in these areas remained completely untouched and abundant for royal visits. The king wanted to be certain that when he decided to hunt, the most magnificent animals would be there, undisturbed. Second, and perhaps more importantly, it was a demonstration of supreme power. Creating a piece of land where no one else could set foot was the ultimate expression of ownership and dominion. It was the king saying, "This piece of the world is mine and no one else's." Peasants living nearby looked at these forbidden forests with a mix of fear and awe. They were lands of inaccessible abundance, a paradise they could only glimpse from afar. The punishments for violating these boundaries were severe. An offender caught inside a closed zone could be branded with hot iron, receiving a visible scar that marked him as a transgressor for life. Others could be banished from their villages, forced into exile and misery, or condemned to heavy forced labor. Over time, these forbidden forests acquired a mythical aura. Villagers, to explain their forbidden and dangerous nature, began creating stories and legends about them. They said they were haunted places, inhabited by nature spirits, malevolent fairies, or monstrous beasts. It was easier to believe in ghosts than to confront the harsh reality. The true monsters were the men guarding those lands, and the prohibition wasn't to protect the people from supernatural dangers, but to protect the king's privilege from the people's presence.
The royal pardon at a price. Amid such an implacable legal system, the idea of mercy seemed a distant concept. However, occasionally, the king offered a royal pardon to a forest law offender. But this clemency was rarely an act of pure kindness or compassion. Most of the time, the pardon was just another tool of power and control, and it always came at a high price, sometimes costlier than the original punishment. A peasant, condemned to death or mutilation for hunting a deer, could suddenly receive an offer of pardon. The joy and relief, however, were fleeting, as the conditions of that pardon were revealed. The price of pardon could take many forms. One of the most common was servitude. The pardoned man could be forced to become a servant on one of the king's or a local lord's properties, losing his freedom and working for the rest of his life in exchange for survival. His family often shared this fate. Another common condition was the loss of land. The peasant would have to surrender the small plot of land his family had tilled for generations, reduced to a landless laborer, totally dependent on others' goodwill. Perhaps the most cynical trade was military service. The illegal hunter, who had demonstrated skill with a bow or knowledge of the forest, was pardoned on the condition of joining the king's army. He escaped the gallows only to be sent to the front lines of a war where his chances of survival were minimal. In this way, the royal pardon wasn't an annulment of the crime, but a conversion of the punishment. The king turned a criminal into an asset, a servant, a soldier, or an example of how disobedience led to total ruin. This system reinforced the monarch's absolute power in an even more subtle way than executions. It showed that the king had the power not only to take life, but also to give it back, though on his own terms. Every pardon was a reaffirmation that everything, from the land and animals to the very life and freedom of his subjects, ultimately belonged to the crown. In the end, every punishment, every execution, and every pardon served the same purpose: to ensure that all, from the highest noble to the humblest peasant, never forgot who held absolute power. And if you think today's laws are unfair, remember, there was a time when hunting a rabbit
could lead you to the gallows. The Middle Ages didn't forgive the weak or the hungry.